9th. So we took a recess, and now we're coming back, and we will be finishing that meeting up. So to start off, I wanted to start off with a roll call, just to make sure for the record we have everybody identified. We do have a quorum tonight, so Sam, if you want to start calling off.
I'm Sam Dedman.
Okay.
Kim Swan.
Final fight.
Stephen Overcash.
So we do have a quorum for that. I don't have any board announcements unless anybody else on the board has anything that they need to share.
No.
Okay, all right, good. And again, because this is a continuation from the previous meeting, the minutes that we need to approve are not completed yet. They'll be added to this meeting. So we're going to go next. So Rick, if you're ready, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Hope everybody did not bundle up today like they've been doing. Yes. It was a nice change. I would like to sort of backtrack just a little bit. We had Article 15 that we had intended to review, but it had not been printed. And so that's gone out now, and it's kind of I think where we left off, we had just done Article 2, which was the general stuff in town. It was the beginning of the character type articles. You know, we sort of finally made it through all the administrative, procedural, and mandate type language. And we got to Article 2, which was the things that kind of are smaller in scale, like fences and, you know, accessory things and air conditioning units and all that stuff. Because you got to cover that. You're not trying to regulate it necessarily. You're trying to address it so that there's not a misconception about what applies and doesn't apply. So that's where you put your exemptions to yard setbacks and all that sort of thing. Okay? Then Article 15 sticks its toe in that character of the community arena for temporary stuff. Temporary stuff. It's all those miscellaneous temporary things that people usually have odd questions about. Well, what about food trucks? What about pods out in the driveway because somebody's home? What about pumpkin patches and sidewalk sales and Christmas trees and farmers markets and yard sales and all that? Well, guess what? Article 15 is the temporary stuff in this package. Okay? And so with that said, I just want to kind of cruise you through how this works. There's a chart on pages 2 and 3. It spills over slightly into page 4. And this chart, remember I said that you have a lot more flexibility with the character type elements. This chart is full of things that you can have some fun with, that you can debate, discuss, tell me what you want to change. But if I didn't put something in there, you might say, well, what would it look like if we added this? So you might decide you don't even want to speak to something, and all we got to do is highlight and delete. But here's the thing, just to sort of walk you through it. The version you're looking at right here is largely based on a lot of polishing and experience. And this one happens to be poached from one that'll be voted on next Wednesday night in Rutherfordton. They're adopting theirs. And then Lowell actually liked it too, and I'll tell you why it's poached from them. Because it gets to the food trucks and tailgate stuff and everything, what we call market or tailgate, fresh foods, people selling corn, selling watermelons, cantaloupes, peaches, apples, whatever, out of the trucks. It's all that truck stuff. If you notice, those two are at the top of page 3, and 156 per calendar year as far as the maximum frequency means 3 times a week year-round. And the reasoning behind that in Rutherfordton was they love food trucks. They just absolutely love food trucks. Now, most towns have a little bit more reins on them. But when you dig into the details, and I'm using that as an example, so if you follow food trucks all the way out across there, you'll see it reference a note. See note 6, and note 6 is on after the table. And note 6 goes into a lot of detail, like, well, is it a food truck that's at a sponsored event? Like, let's say there's the Landis Hula Hoop Festival, and everybody's gonna be hula hooping downtown, and so over there on the other side of the tracks in the downtown area, you wanna be able to have food trucks line up on each side of the street and where normally people might park, and then everybody walks into the festival area. You follow me? In those kind of situations, you're opening the street up to pedestrian and vendor use, but you're closing it down or restricting it on conventional traffic. And you're doing that through usually a resolution adopted by the governing board, the Board of Aldermen, okay? Now, on a normal day, let's suppose that my grandson's gonna get married. Well, let's suppose that one of my other sons is gonna get married, because I've had 3 that are not. 2 that are and 3 that are not. Now, let's suppose one's gonna get married, so I wanna have a food truck for that rehearsal party that we're gonna entertain them. We're gonna be in the neighborhood, or we're gonna be somewhere like that, just randomly around town. Well, we've got to restrict, we don't want them blocking the street. We don't want them, doing that sort of thing. We want them off the street, on the private property. That's why, so you got a lot of different kinds of circumstances where a food truck, and that's why when you read that, it'll say, is this a town-sponsored event? That's where there's some order to it. It's kind of governed and set up and arranged and managed, versus somebody in the neighborhood just hires a food truck to come park in the street in front of their house, and you got 40 people drinking beer out in the street now, or something like that.
Mr. Chairman, may I have a point of privilege, please, if I'm doing this correctly? I just got a text, we're apparently not live on YouTube.
I will go check with Shane.
Thank you.
I'll stop for just a moment.
I think it did the same thing at the last meeting too, that was not live.
It was not live?
For some time into the meeting.
Yeah, we're live.
Yep, I just got another text saying we're on now.
Amber, we're live.
Is there a delay? that we
Yeah,
have? No?
yeah, I think there was just a small delay.
Gotcha.
Must have been a little delay in kicking off.
Thank you.
So on Article 15, the special events and temporary structures, it is intended to fill in the blank on all the miscellaneous things, so that they're not filtered away and hidden all over the rest of the town ordinances in hiding places. This brings it out, lumps it in one location. So if we were to ever add something, let's say somebody invents a new thing, we suddenly start having, I don't know, drone races or something like that, then, temporary events, neighborhood drone racing, or whatever the next thing is. This is where you fold in those kinds of criteria. And so you'll just need to take a look at it. It's got everything from sidewalks, sales, outdoor bazaars, and retail sales, which might be a parking lot type of thing. Model home, real estate offices, because people you would be surprised how many calls come into town hall to the planning department about things like that. Like, well, gosh, can they do that? Can they, can they do this? Can they do that in my neighborhood? This is where we have to spell it out in here. So if you see things about frequencies and what have you, or durations, frequency is how many times a year or per week or whatever. Duration might be how long can an event go on. Just bring that up, and we can circle back on this, since it was not available to you last time. We can circle back on this next time as well, so don't worry about that. I also want to say something about the permit requirement. The reason for a permit requirement on these small things like this has nothing to do with collecting revenue for the town, none whatsoever. In fact, I quite often recommend that they be a very low or almost no cost type of permit. The whole idea of the permit is to make sure that you get the applicant to and can have the conversation about the information. You can make sure that you can inform them. The same thing we do, like when we talked about Article 2 last time, about fences. You know, it's really just to make sure that you're informing them before they take off out and just have Lowe's pop the fence in. Same thing with yard sales and things like that. Now, in here right now, yard sales, in this draft don't call for a permit. Some places say yes, some places say no. So those yeses and nos are very, very easy. There are some things you can deal with in the fee schedule. I usually recommend that it be zero cost for these little temporary events, unless it's something that does require, you know, a lot of staff time to administer, you know. But typically these don't. These don't have site plans. They don't have all this other stuff. You're just coordinating with someone, you know, to make sure. So take a look at that, and we can dig into that at the next. Thank you for indulging me. I want to go back and kind of introduce that item that was on the agenda as we started our last meeting, or the first part of this meeting earlier in the month, but it had not been distributed. So I wanted to introduce that to kind of pick up with the order from the 8th, I believe, February 9th. Now, from that point, we're going to, since technically it's listed for review, but it hadn't been introduced. So now I want to go back and hit the stuff that we had introduced and see if there's anything to review. On Article 22, we talked about that last time. We shared that information and everything. That's on the grandparenting clause. Remember, nonconformity is the technical term for grandparenting clause. That's pretty much almost the end of the boring stuff. And hearing none, I'll ask if there were any comments on the administration and enforcement. That's what creates the process for administration, authorizes the position, creates that sort of thing, and defines any enforcement related to it, you know, and what happens as if an enforcement action is required. That's where all that's spelled out. And so that is kind of the end of the administrative and procedural aspects. Article 18 was flood damage prevention, and I think I mentioned last time we met on the 9th that that was the new model from the state. They had just released it way back in July of 2020 and didn't tell anybody. So we just found out about it. So we had to hustle it up, get it out the door back to the state. You know, we have to take our version and send it back to them, and they go through and review it to make sure that we didn't change anything they didn't want changed. And so that's what's going on now. There were a couple of edits in there, like who administers yours. One of the things we found out is that Rowan County does administer for all the municipalities in the county. So they do it for the city of Salisbury. They do it just like they do building inspections. They do the flood damage prevention stuff. And so we've been coordinating directly with Shane about that and what have you. So that's moving right along. Now, the one thing that we did change since the draft that you got in your hands is they requested that the problem with using the county to administer that code or that ordinance on flood damage prevention is that they really don't want different versions out there. They don't want a different standard in Landis. And I had recommended, just like the state's recommending, that we increase that freeboard, which is that distance above the floodplain, to the finished floor of a house to help reduce damages and insurance claims and premiums and everything else. And they're not wanting to do that. They don't want to have 4 feet in Landis and 2 feet in China Grove. But 2 feet's not working. So I pulled back up the flood maps today. Just today. I pulled those maps back up to look, and we really don't have much of a big hazard in our jurisdiction. We really don't. We don't have, we're not right out there along the main part of Coldwater Creek or, Irish Buffalo Creek or any of those, and not in a big way. We've got some tributaries and a little bit of reach, but not enough to where we're looking at extensive flood damage. So I don't see a problem if we leave it at 2 for the time being, knowing that as we move this thing along, maybe we can get it up, get everybody in the county up to 3 or 4 at some point in the near future. Folks along the Yadkin River, that's a different story. You know, some of the tributaries that flow into that, just before you get to the river, those have a much more substantial flood damage potential in a lot of jurisdictions. But Landis doesn't get out into any major ones. If you want to look at your community in detail on flood, there's a great website for that, and it's the Flood Risk Insurance System, and the acronym is FRIS, or FRIS, FRIS. And so if you go to fris.org, you are looking at the world, and you click on North Carolina, and then you can zoom down to Landis, and it's so easy. You can literally go to zoom in to where you see property near a creek, and you just click your mouse, and where you click your mouse, it will give you the base flood elevation if there is one. It will give you all that information. So it's so easy to get the information now, and that's why I was able to just look and really kind of gauge, do we really have substantial risk in Landis's jurisdiction? And as a former certified floodplain administrator, I actually let mine lapse December 31st, simply because I was drowning in so much work on projects. I may try to reinstate it next year, but I just simply couldn't get my hours in this year. Because I have multiple certifications, that was just one of them, and I had to give something up for the sake of class time and everything else. And so I am formally qualified. My qualification expired, but I'm formally qualified to speak to that matter. But anyway, that's where you can find information about it. So right now, your draft you have in front of you has 4 feet of freeboard in the mapped areas and 3 feet in the unmapped areas. And the reason for that is a mapped area means it's the bigger part of the creek. The unmapped area might be a little small tributary that the feds didn't even think was worth doing anything with. And so what that would be up to would be the local surveyor to identify and calculate. And that's what your draft has in it. The county wants you to go to 2 and 2, just 2 feet across the board. State wants you to go to 4 and 3. We're authorized to go to 4 and 4. I think 4 and 3 is a good balance. But it's up to you to make that recommendation as to whether I change it or don't change it. Okay? I don't see a problem with going to 2 and 2 for now, if it avoids a bunch of unnecessary crisis with the county. But at the same time, if there were properties that were more at risk in Landis's jurisdiction, I would feel much stronger that we do improve that freeboard requirement. Again, that's the height of the floor in your house, the finished floor in your house above the regulated floodplain, which is the 1% flood condition. That means it has a chance of occurring 1% of the time. That's a lot. Some people used to call it 100-year flood, except you have them 2 or 3 times a year. So it's really not 100-year, once in every 100 year. It's really more like you have a 1% chance of having it happen
Is this
on any given day or
Is
any
this
given
unique
rain
to
event.
homes that are, what have crawl spaces, what I call traditional style versus slab?
It gets into all of that because you can't do slabs in floodplains unless you build it up. Now, we've got some things that you're going to be seeing in just a little while tonight that really alleviate the problem for us going forward. So really what you're talking about is existing structures or the construction of maybe agricultural buildings on existing farms. Because from the standpoint of new subdivisions, we've got a solution to that just takes the whole flood insurance and everything off the table, takes the need for it off the table, and you'll see what that is when we get into the second half of our meeting tonight. Okay? So before you make any decisions, remember, I'm trying to sort of unveil all kinds of information, and then you'll have a little better perspective on how kind of this all fits together. Okay? I'm about practical solutions. I'm all about practical solutions. So anyway, that's what 18 is. Article 2, were there any comments on that? That's the one that was that first of the character-based articles. It's the one, it's up front for a reason, because you don't want to have to dig too deep for these things, but the table of contents kind of gives you a good oversight of it. You know, building separation, accessory uses, accessory fixtures, air conditioning unit. Nuisances, driveway permits, special, certain lots along thoroughfares, like where there might need to be some straightening out of the setback. Because some of those old thoroughfares, like this highway right here, before this was 29A, well, it's not even 29A anymore. Before it was just Main Street, it was 29A Main Street. Before it was 29A, it was 29. Before it was 29, it was the National Highway, dating back 100 years ago. And there are many stretches of this road that do not have a defined platted right-of-way. In other words, it's not drawn on a map to a specific dimension and recorded. So what the DOT maintains is what is considered to be a prescriptive easement, meaning that, well, they've been maintaining it, so it's now their responsibility for the state. It's now the public right-of-way. Another nickname for it used to be referred to as the back of ditch to back of ditch right-of-way, meaning it was the edge of the maintenance. When they would maintain the road, maintain the shoulders, and maintain the ditches, then they stopped at the back of the ditch. That's why they called it a back of ditch to back of ditch. Well, when you're measuring setbacks for new development and you don't have a prescribed right-of-way, then what we are doing in that particular part of Article 2 is declaring a right-of-way on certain thoroughfares. And this is really tied to the norms for those types of thoroughfares. So if it was a typical two-lane state primary, like 29 was through here, it was typically a 60-foot right-of-way, and so that just says we would measure it as if it was a recorded 60-foot right-of-way. So it doesn't do anything to anybody that it wouldn't do somewhere else. It just makes it easy to interpret and easy to administer when you've got a consistent foundation or consistent basis under it. Because I've heard people go, oh yeah, my land goes to the middle of the road. Well, that sounds great, but it really doesn't. Your deed might, but the prescriptive easement that the state's been maintaining since the 1930s, okay, when the state took over all the county roads, says otherwise. So you might get to pay taxes on it if you really want to argue about it, but it really is the state's right-of-way to the edge of the maintenance, okay? If there's not a dedicated and platted right-of-way. So that's all the kind of stuff that fits in here. Manufactured home parks. It leads off in there with the prohibition of manufactured home parks, and the reason it does that is and then it says except for, and there's two exceptions. One is existing manufactured home parks that are able to achieve a very basic standard of safety, okay? And then they can receive a continuation permit. And just to give you an idea how well that works, that was invented in your next door neighbor 34 years ago this summer. And I got a call the other day from someone, because a mobile home park is being sold that has one of those continuation permits that it obtained, and they contacted me, and it was quite an honor. They actually even had a photograph of me that was in the newspaper, of me handing the owners and operators the continuation permit in 1989 after they had met their improvements and everything else. So that was started very first in North Carolina, very first of anywhere anybody knows about in Kannapolis, North Carolina, because there were so many mobile home parks in Kannapolis traditionally. There were 156 when the city incorporated. So anyway, that's still alive and well in a lot of cities and towns. So there's a way, you prohibit the non-conforming ones, then you give them an out, a way to continue. Now there's also the ability to do new ones through an overlay district, which would require a rezoning. It's not automatic anywhere. Okay, so you don't have to worry about somebody just popping up with a new mobile home park. They would have to apply for a rezoning, which would come to this board, and then it would go to the governing board and all that. But the tool is in the toolbox should you decide you want to do that because of the trends in tiny homes and RVs, campgrounds, all kinds of other things, because they're essentially the same thing, okay? The biggest limits might be on durations of stay. So the provisions are in there for existing ones, and there are provisions in there for new ones, and that kicks it all off right there by saying they're prohibited, meaning you can't do it, just go out and do it without going through one of those two processes, okay? Septic tanks, murals. People always ask about murals. Sculptures. Is that sculpture they put out there, is that okay? Well, most ordinances are silent on that stuff. You really need to speak to murals and sculptures and things like that. If you want to create an interesting place, you need some foundational guidelines for it. You know, so you go to Waynesville or someplace like that where there's, you know, metal street art everywhere you go, you know, and it works, and it has become a big tool for them. In Rutherfordton, they've got all that kind of stuff too. Lots of towns do, so we build that in, and it helps you to make a determination, because a lot of people, without guidance, don't know that a Coca-Cola sign painted on the side of a brick drugstore in 1932 that gets refurbished, they say, well, is it a sign or is it a mural? Well, logic will tell you it's probably not a sign because you can't find a Coke for 5 cents anymore. But technically, what is it? So you need all this. That's why I call this the ragu. You really need everything addressed. So when the question comes up at City Hall, somebody calls, and it always starts with a citizen calling and saying, hey, I saw this the other day. What about this? I don't like it, or can they do that, or whatever. There's a way to look and answer the question. Now, if you see something in there that you want to change about that, I would suggest it, but it's foundational language. You know, if you want to open that gate and just not care about it, then it's easy to delete and just reserve that section. Okay? Short-term rentals. You know what short-term?
Rick, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
2.22.4 mentions a historic preservation commission.
If you have one, yeah.
If you have one.
Mhm. Yep. If you don't have it, you don't have it. If you have it, your ordinance is already ready for it.
Are murals always considered to be on walls?
Generally speaking, they're on some kind of vertical. They might not be on a building wall. They might be on a barrier wall, like a wall around a property of some type. Okay, generally speaking. Short-term rentals. There's a corporate name for those right now, and I understand they've been hit pretty hard in the aftermath of the pandemic, called Airbnb, because they told everybody they could have a refund, and they didn't bother to ask the people who were actually renting the property out. So this deals with that. Okay, this deals with short-term rentals when they become real. You know, if somebody's coming to town, and if my sister-in-law comes up and stays one weekend with my wife and I, that's not a short-term rental. If my sister-in-law picks up the phone and pretends like she doesn't know us and calls us and tells us she wants to rent the same room and tells us she'll give us $25 or $50 to stay there, and she pays through an app, which is what Airbnb is. It's not a land use, it's an app. It's nothing but a method of booking and paying and reserving and that sort of thing. A land use is the actual act of renting your house out as a B&B. Well, if it's an incidental thing, it's not really a bed and breakfast, and I don't think it's really a change in use. Now, if they're renting 2 or 3 rooms a week, you know, traffic coming and going, they're just a B&B. They're a real B&B. You know, it doesn't matter if they book online or if they picked up the phone or if they sent you a postcard. The way that somebody books or the way that somebody pays does not affect land use. So there are tons of Airbnb properties out there that are actually violating bed and breakfast standards that have been on ordinances for 30, 40 years, simply because of the proliferation of them now. We're not trying to ban them. We're trying to get a handle on it when they become more than incidental. When they're incidental, It's no different than my sister-in-law staying with us one weekend. If somebody gives you $75, if she gave us $75 to help with the food, whatever, it's not really a business. When it becomes a real business, that's when it changes land use, and there are provisions in here into the normal use table for bed and breakfast. Because I've seen bed and breakfast where you could actually go eat there. You didn't have to stay. You could just go eat in the dining room, that sort of thing. So, and that becomes part of the art of zoning administration, that the staff has to really make a determination. Is it really all that, or is it just something incidental? And then they have to be able to use that judgment. And this kind of language gives them guidance on how to make those decisions. So that's what 2 was about. And then, of course, there was 15, which I started off with introducing tonight. And since I introduced it a little while ago, I know you haven't had time to relax and read through it, so I don't know that I can really review it tonight. And so we may need to make sure that it's on the March agenda as well. I believe that's the 9th, when we come back together, the next meeting.
Yes.
I believe it's March 9th. So I'm going to suggest that we have that back on for review on March 9th. That's 15, because you will have had a chance to review it. The draft rules of procedure for planning boards and board of adjustment, those are really up to you. There's some things in there that's highlighted in yellow. That's probably back in tab 27, I believe it is, if I remember my tab numbering. Yep. You'll see some stuff in there that's that you may want to say, well, we want to add this to our agenda, our standard format agenda. See, that's what you were working with tonight. That's kind of a standard format agenda for the beginning of a meeting, not necessarily the reconvening of an existing meeting. But that's why that's all highlighted in yellow, to give you some things to look at. It talks about 6 o'clock in here. You might want to go back to your 7. You might like your 5. You might like your 5:30. All those things that are high, everything in there is up to you. But please look at it. And if you see something in yellow, put your ideas down. And when we get to discussion and review, we can get to that, refine it, and keep moving. Because those rules of procedure, just like the rest of the ordinance, will go to the alderman for them to vote on as well. Okay? So with that said, let me just catch up with myself here. 22, 2, 15, 18, 23. That brings us to the second half of the material tonight, which is the introductions of some new material. Before we took off down that review, I mentioned that we had finally gotten to the character part, but we kind of had to back up and review some of the mandate and administrative, procedural, all those kinds of things. But we are really leaping into now with Article 11 and 12, and I'm going to introduce them together into that character stuff. 11 and 12 are like, I call them the peanut butter and jelly sections. 11 is your landscape requirements and tree protection, and 12 is your off-street parking, stacking, and loading. And the reason they're peanut butter and jelly is you generally are doing new landscape components under the standards and specifications of an ordinance as part of a new construction project. Let's say we're building a new Chuck E. Cheese. I'm going to pick something from the past. And we're going to have a parking lot, and in that parking lot we have to have certain landscape areas and, islands and, order to the parking lot. It's not just a big sea of asphalt. There's some order to it. Well, those landscape requirements generally are driven by the parking and things of that nature. Now, there's also some buffers, like you might find between where a residential district is next to a commercial district, and the commercial property is developing, so it's going to do a little bit more landscaping, maybe some more substantial buffering and maybe even screening in those things. And that all depends on some of these relationships, okay? And you'll see that charted early on in Article 11. I'll kind of point that out so you can get your arms around that pretty easily. The buffers, in terms of the dimensions, jump out at you on page 5, and right behind it on page 6, and that's why there's a bunch of yellow on page 6, is the matrix for determining when a district, a development district abuts an existing development in an adjacent district, what buffer requirements would apply in those circumstances. So industrial development in your neighborhood is going to be far more impactful, bigger buffer requirements, things of that nature, than maybe a mixed-use district might have, where there's a old house that's being converted to an office next door to a house that's still a house. Things like that. So you'll see that matrix in there, and that's also yellow highlighted for me, because right now I'm still guessing at the types of districts that we're going to end up with. I'm not really guessing. I kind of know, because I'm way ahead of y'all in the drafts and writing. I'm actually finished, with the exception of the map, with my draft of everything. We've been up here looking and driving and walking and learning and figuring it out and all that. So, but anyway, that's the landscaping, and the parking gets into parking ratios and for different uses and things of that nature, and how you buffer and what perimeters you might have around the parking lots and all those things. So that's the peanut butter and jelly. I just wanted to introduce them to you. So as you read through them, you'll kind of know that's their counterpart. The reason they're in separate articles is so that the design professional that's using the ordinance doesn't have to scroll back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. They can open both files, and they can get their components on their bit, because everybody uses, all the design people now use a fairly large monitor. So they used to use 2 screens, now they just use a big one, because it's cheaper to go to the Best Buy and get a TV with that you can just use with your computer. And so that's the way we do it, is you'll have your parking and landscaping and everything right there while you're working on your drawings in handy reach. There is, for some people, a third ingredient to the PB&J. It's bananas. Some people like a banana on their peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that's Article 17. So I wanted to kind of roll that out easier. Because guess where the majority of freestanding signs are? They're integrated into those landscape areas that are integrated into parking. So they tend to fit together like peanut butter and jelly with banana on it. Article 17 is not dovetail sitting because the design professional is going to figure out where they want the sign, and then they'll come back and look at the sign height stuff and everything else. But that's what that is. And the sign standards and specifications that I write now are far smaller than what we used to do. This is where one of these development ordinances lost about almost 15 pages of weight in the sign sections. And that was a result of a U.S. Supreme Court case a few years ago. And we're going to get into that in just a little bit, in a little bit more detail, because that's an important one. A federal Supreme Court case that had a profound effect on limitations on signage. So I want to kind of walk you through 17, because it's its own little world. It's also a world where the greatest degree of creativity from the creative professions, like designers, resides. Probably more creativity in signage than architecture. But there's no way we can anticipate every scenario. So we try to write around understanding what we know and what we are usually concerned with, and then leave the creative side plenty of room to do their thing, to be effective for their clients and for their customers, for those businesses. So we give them some guidelines, and we use photographs so that everybody's sort of getting ideas and looking at different ways to look at it. So we talk about the prohibited stuff right up front and the exempt stuff right up front. Prohibited might be things that create a problem. An example in Kannapolis, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but when we first did the sign and zoning ordinance in Kannapolis, we had a car lot on South Cannon Boulevard that building's not there anymore. It was torn down and something else was built there. Actually, a new car lot was built there, but the old building was torn down. And they had a stop sign on the side of the building with strobing lights around the outline of the stop sign. And I lived there in that area, and I pulled up to Cannon Boulevard one night on a really bad weather night like we've had recently, foggy and rainy and things like that, and I virtually couldn't see the real stop sign. You know, how visibility at night in the wet weather a lot of times is poor, but I could see that other one, and I thought, you know, if I didn't know where I was, that is where I would have gauged the intersection to be, which means I would run right through the 4-lane. Okay, and that's why that sort of thing is in here. That if it conflicts with public safety signs, things of that nature, you got to be super careful with it. While we want them to advertise their business, we want them to not do things that create potential miscommunication. So that's what the prohibited type stuff kind of dances with in there. So when you look at that. The portable signs, where it talks about portable signs, except as specifically permitted herein, which means the temporary stuff. What you're really talking about is, remember the little yellow signs you used to see everywhere, and a lot of times they were on wheels, or they all had these legs that would stick out, and people would go out there and, you know, put a message up, and then 40 years later it'd be kind of falling down on one side and looking real bad and drug out by the edge of the street and everything else. Well, that's why that stuff has to be dealt with. Changing copy is not a problem. But mount the thing. Anchor it so it doesn't, you know, the wind doesn't blow it out in the road. Or I've had all this stuff happen. I've had all of this stuff in my experience in this work. Exempt signs are generally those things that are like warnings, traffic control, like stop signs, street names, you know, danger, high voltage. You know, there's lots of that public safety, public information stuff that's exempt. Signage. You may have wayfinding signage that points to where the park is and where the school is and where the church is and where different things are around town, that is put up by the town to try to keep people, you know, informed and what have you. So there's that. Then we get into the exemption of the obvious. Machine signs. You'll see that popping up on page 4. And incidental signs. An incidental sign, and this one we use photographs. Somebody's business hours, open, closed, you know, that kind of incidental stuff. Machine signs, this one happens to be an ATM machine, but you see them all the time. Gas pumps, vending machines, soft drinks, etc. Those all by definition are some type of sign. So we speak to that. So somebody doesn't come up and get sideways over, well, they've got a Coke machine, that should count as part of their signs, you know, because one business gets mad at another. Because the biggest problem is usually between two businesses. One of them will make the other one mad, and the town will get in the middle of it. So we spell it all out in the ragu sauce. We spell it all out. Here it is. This is what they are. So it becomes very clear, and you're not debating, is a Coke machine a sign or not a sign? Yeah, it's a sign, but it's exempt. It's not counted towards your normal credits. So if you're advertising Exxon or, you know, Starbucks or whatever, it doesn't take away from that if you've got a Coke machine in front of your convenience store. You still get to have the Coke machine. Unless, of course, the town of Landis wants to change all that. Remember, these are the character elements, so you can tighten some screws up on that if you choose to. I don't recommend it, but if you choose to. This is also where we deal with other exemptions like flags. People say, well, You know, they've got this giant American flag at the car lot now. That was a big thing a number of years ago. And we've seen battles all over North Carolina recently about that. Camping centers and gas stations where they get a sign that was as big as, you know, Central Park and put it up on a pole to, is it patriotism or is it advertising? You know, it was usually an effort to kind of sidestep sign limitations. So we speak to that. We speak to all of this stuff. We say, you know, if it's a real flag, it's a real flag. If it's a governmental insignia, it's a real thing. If it's a giant smiley face, that's not a real flag. Now, there is one let me go back to prohibited for just a minute because we're about to introduce. Well, no, I'm gonna come back. I'm gonna come back to it. I'm gonna go on into permanent, your larger permanent stuff. That picks up on page 9. I mean, the details start on page 6, the written details. The easy part, the pictures, the table, that really start to sort of paint the picture, so to speak. Start on page 9, where we're talking about blade or projecting, V, flat, or wall signs. You know, are we talking about something on a pole? Are we talking about something that's on a window? Are we talking about directional? Are we talking about outdoor directories, awnings and canopies, monuments? You know, little decorative pole signs in front of old houses that might be a law office now or something. That all shows up in those tables. And the photographs help you figure out what really we're talking about, and they're intended to help with that. And I'm going to give you a classic example. The bottom of page 10, you'll see the last two. You'll see awning and canopy. I can't tell you how many ordinances in the state of North Carolina, but there are a bunch of them, will say something to the effect of awning and canopy signs can, you know, are limited to this size and this height and this and that. And you look at that photograph right there, they're nothing alike. So they might say awning and canopy signs can only be 10-inch wide or high letters and all that when they're really talking about an awning over the doorway. A canopy is that thing you pump gas under. So we have to offer some clarification in here. And the sizing on the signs and all of that stuff. In fact, we have minimum size letters on these, not a maximum. We have a minimum size letters. We give them a copy area, but we don't want them writing so small that it actually is distracting for the driver, the motorist, or whatever, or either they miss something and then they create a traffic situation making a sudden, oh, look, I just passed it, I see it now, turn. So you want to be effective. And I actually got a lot of my sign criteria from none other than one of my good friends growing up who went to work for a sign company. I said, Kent, how, you know, do y'all have any science to this? He said, oh yeah. He said, if you're going 70 miles an hour down the interstate and, you know, a billboard that's 80 feet high and that's, you know, 420 square feet or something like that, doesn't look big, but it has to be big because you've got to first see it and register it and you're moving quickly. And if you went in there and put something up that's 36 square feet like you might see in downtown, it would look like a postage stamp. You know, so there's a criteria behind travel speed, sight distance, in other words, how far are you away from it, things of that nature. So a lot of that science is actually even in the smaller signs as well. That's why we have that minimum letter size of 6 inches on canopies. We don't want miscommunication out there. If you're gonna put something up there, let's don't create awkwardness. The last thing we need is somebody running into somebody else at the gas pump because they're trying to read something they can't read. So it's about practical and common sense approaches. Now, if there's any numbers in here that you want to discuss after you've had time to read this and we get back together at the next meeting in March, we can go all the way in that. We can change these things around, okay? We've got a lot of leeway in that. It should make sense. And some of these things are kind of tied together with a strategic thing. In other words, you want to encourage them to do more on their building. than on poles out by the street, because then you get a lot of other issues that come into play with cluttering up streetscape and things like that. So you want to give a little bit more credit, I think, for and encouragement for people to do nice stuff on the buildings themselves, and a little less credit out on the poles at the road.
Landis currently has a signed ordinance. Does this parallel it, or is it totally different from?
Takes it all out. This would replace all of that.
As far as these numbers are concerned,
Yeah.
height, square footage?
Right, if you like the old ones you got,
No, just a question,
mark them up.
just a question.
Yeah, it takes all that. It
Starts over.
page 1 of Article 1 repeals all those old ordinances.
But the old ordinance was not used in order to write the
No.
new ordinance? Okay,
No,
that's the question.
this is based on real science. It is.
No, I'm not doubting you.
And I'm gonna say something, that I like it when a planning board is really tuned in to looking at the methodologies. I have been in so many rooms before growing up in this business where planning boards would say, well, I don't think it should be more than 10 or 20 or 30 or 40. And I'm like, why are all those multiples of 10? You know, are you just making these numbers up? Yeah, and I've seen a lot of that. I was in Spencer yesterday, and I was concerned about the historic district on setbacks, and I looked at my draft that I had done for them, and I had 12 feet in there, and after Tom and I measured it on some streets where we saw some houses that we were a little bit concerned about, that 12 feet's gonna be perfect. They had a lot of older houses built. You know, that's the largest historic district in the state of North Carolina that's contiguous. And they've got a lot of houses that are built around 14, 13, 14 feet from the right-of-way, from the back of the sidewalk. And so the effort there is to not throw those under the bus by coming up with some magic new number like they did when Cabarrus County adopted zoning that applied to the Cabarrus County side of Kannapolis. They had applied the zoning district through those mill villages that required a 30-foot front setback. If anything happened to any of those houses, because all those houses were built around 22 to 24 in those older mill villages in Kannapolis. You know, you can't just make this stuff up, especially if you're applying a district designed for new subdivisions to a older neighborhood. You really can't just make it up. And so I don't use anything that rhymes with anything. You'll see that when we get into districts. You know, when I've got lot sizes that are like 72 feet or 11,600 square feet, not 10, 20, 10,000 to 20,000. Seriously, there are zoning ordinances out there that jump from 10 to 20,000. I've got two in between those two numbers, two districts. One at 11,600, one at 17,450. And there's a rhyme to that. And you'll see that when I share with you the test results. So we're going to have a slideshow the next meeting. Well, I shouldn't call it a slideshow. Remember when you were in school, we called them a film strip. We're going to have a film strip today. The younger ones may not remember that. We called it film strip. We're going to have a film strip. And everybody got excited going to class when you had a film strip. And so we're going to have a film strip at the March meeting. And so you're going to get introduced to your district concepts by looking at real pictures of places, not tables, and saying, oh my gosh, look at all these numbers. You know, look at all these standards. You're going to look at places, and those numbers reflect those places. So if you don't like the place, we change the number. You follow me? So you can see what it would look like. You can see what that translates into. Okay? Predominantly in residential subdivisions, which is where most people get their excitement. So I'm working my way through, but I want to mention one more thing before we circle back. I'm going to skip over temporary for just a moment because that's where we get to that Supreme Court case. And I want to bring you up to page 16 where we introduce master sign plans. Master sign plan might apply to something of some significant size that's unique. An example might be a large manufacturing building. This is a real life story in Cabarrus County. Manufacturing building sits on the corner of a U.S. highway and a state primary highway. And the manufacturing business went away a number of years ago, and the owner of the building divided the building up into multiple units. and has office space in there, has some warehouse distribution space in it, has salons and, you know, all kinds of stuff in this building on different sides and parts of it. So when you pull into what used to be a manufacturing facility, you got multiple buildings and multiple uses. And so a master sign plan was important there because you might have tenants that are down one side. And so using this kind of sign and that kind of sign with a directory and some things like that, that where just the standard just wouldn't work, okay? Because the standard is really looking at it on a per business basis. So the master sign plan is usually when you get involved in something that might involve multiple tenants. Because every business has the same rights, the way I write the ordinance. Some towns will look at it architecturally. And that may sound like a wonderful idea. And there are certain, you know, the David Creeches of the world that would probably say, oh gosh, it should be proportional, it should be like this. If you got a big building, you know, you could have a little bit bigger sign and it would look balanced. But if you got a small building, the sign needs to be smaller so it would look balanced and architecturally correct. And there's a lot to be said for that side of the coin. But I've been afraid for years and years and years that there's another Supreme Court case that just hasn't been had yet, where these ordinances that tie your copy area of your signage to the amount of building wall that you control equates your freedom of speech to your wealth. The amount of property you control, we'll call it wealth. Whether you rent it or own it, doesn't matter. The property you control is part of your wealth. And if you can speak louder because you control bigger building wall, I don't contend that would survive a litmus test in the courts of the Supreme Court of the United States. That's just my professional opinion. So I write them to where they are fair. So if I've got a smaller building than you, I get the same sign privileges. But we try to encourage them to use those privileges in certain ways, okay? And you'll see that as you dive into this. There's a science to this part too. So your signage is the banana that goes with the peanut butter jelly of gluing your building to the ground. Because your building is accented by its landscapes, its parking, its hardscape areas, its signage, all those sorts of things that take a building and anchor it to a place, okay? So that's what that part is. Now I want to circle back on the temporary signage part for just a moment. This is very serious stuff. One of the biggest thorns in the side of a lot of communities has to do with temporary signs, and they come in all shapes and sizes and types. So we're going to just sort of single out something like I'm having a yard sale Saturday, and I've got this cardboard box from Amazon that somebody gave me because I don't buy anything from them. And I tore that box up, and I made me some little yard sale signs, and I got my staple gun out, and I'm going around town. I'm going to stick some signs on some telephone poles, and I'm going to make me some money Saturday. I'm hoping to get $200 for all this junk I've got in my garage. So, typical ordinances would say that yard sale signs can only be up 7 days or 10 days. That was the two biggies. 1 week, 2 weeks, 10 days, maybe those three durations before the event. Had to be down within 3 days of the event. Could be no more than 2 square feet in size. Couldn't be stapled on a pole. You know, they had this criteria for it. Then they had some other criteria for the politicians that said, well, you know, you can put your signs up 45 days ahead of the election. You got to have them down within 10 days of the election or 3 days of the election. And you can't put them out here, but you can put them out there, and had all this stuff. How do you tell the difference between a real estate sign, a political sign, a campaign sign, and a yard sale sign? How do you tell the difference? Anybody got any ideas how you can look at it and tell which one's which?
Other than the verbiage?
Exactly. That's my point. Reed v. Gilbert in southwestern United States, Supreme Court case, 2000, made it all the way to the federal Supreme Court. I believe it was in 15. If I've got my recollection correct. And the point of it is that there was a church that had a donation bin out beside the park, in the parking area of the church. And they had a sign on the donation bin for donations, clothing. And it was out there for a long time. And across the street was another business that had whatever they had out. They had a sign out for going out of business, or I don't remember what their sign said. Okay? But along comes the city's code enforcement officer and says to the church, well, that's a temporary sign on that bin, and you've got a 30-day duration on that. And they're like, well, over there, they've had this up for longer than that. And the sign enforcement officer said, well, that's a different classification or something along those lines. So in come the lawyers. And several years of up that ladder from local all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, we get basically a ruling that says, ratified, I believe it actually came from the Court of Appeals, but that coins the phrase content neutrality. Content neutrality. If you have to read the message in order to categorize the sign for regulatory purposes, you're out of bounds. So, we have to be content neutral in our standards. Now, what does that really, really mean? Before I answer the question, I want to remind you of something that you saw in Article 1. Everybody remembers Article 1. That's the thing that creates the whole ordinance and sets it in place and, you know, clarifies the jurisdiction, the authority, all the mumbo-jumbo that goes with that. But there was one little provision up there that was called severability. The severability clause basically means that, or basically says that if any component of that ordinance anywhere in there is ever deemed unconstitutional or invalid by a court of competent jurisdiction, like a Supreme Court or something like that, that it is considered severed, chopped out of the ordinance, and the remainder of the ordinance lives on. It doesn't invalidate the whole ordinance. You follow me? It just whacks out that part that's been deemed invalid. So the rest of the ordinance remains intact. There's another provision up in Article 1 called conflict, the conflict clause. And it says that if a provision of this ordinance is ever in conflict with another law or another provision of the ordinance, this is how you weigh the difference. Okay? The more stringent shall apply, or whatever the case may be, based on that conflict clause. Typically, it's the more stringent shall apply. So if suddenly your ordinance says we've got yard sale signs limited to a foot, can be up 7 days or 10 days, or 2 feet can be up 7 or 10 days, and we got political signs that can be up this and be that size, and we got house for sale, my for sale sign in front of the house. Well, I'm not selling my house, but if I were, the for sale sign in front of my house. What's the typical duration that those are permitted? There's no duration. Ordinances typically just let those fly. But when you factor in content neutrality, meaning we can't read the sign to classify it for regulatory purposes. We can only look at its height and size and location, or any other design feature, not what it says. Okay? And we take into account the conflict clause. How long, if I've got a yard sale provision, and I got a real estate, and I got a political, and I got all these provisions for these different kinds of temporary signs, how long can my real estate sign stay up, and how big can it be now? Remember, the more stringent shall apply. So I can have my 1 foot real estate sign up for 1 week or 10 days. The more stringent, in other words, all of those get blended together, and they take out the most stringent time frame, the most stringent height, the most stringent copy area size. So what I've done on temporary signs is we can't touch those kinds of things. What we say now is that in a residential district, okay, that temporary signs can be up X number of months or days and can be this size. In commercial districts, they can be a little bit bigger and they can be up X number of months and that sort of thing, okay? That counts for political, real estate, yard sale, puppies for sale, selling my kids, whatever.
So the content's irrelevant.
Content is out the window. Now, I contend, and this is my disclaimer to you, I contend that that case was fairly narrow because it didn't take into account public safety issues like traffic control devices, stop sign, danger, high voltage, warning, steep cliff, sharp curve, name of the street, things like that. So I've got that public safety stuff captured, and I call it out as to why. So if we ever did draw a challenge, I think that would fly. But I don't think it's going to be Landis that draws that kind of challenge. I'm kind of waiting on New York or LA or somebody like that to say, okay, we got to get this sorted out at the higher court level. But I think right now everybody's just been saying, well, they didn't really mean, safety things. They were really talking about promotions or whatever you're advertising, and I think that litmus test would probably uphold, but there's no way that I can speak for a court like that. So right now, I exempt public safety related issues, warning, speed limit, stop, whatever. But the other subjects like promoting things, yard sale, house for sale, vote for me, I'll set you free, all that stuff is right now it's solidified into two little boxes, the residential areas and the non-residential areas. So how long can my election sign when I run for mayor stay out now? 6 months. How long can my yard sale sign stay up? 6 months. How long can my house for sale sign stay up? 6 months. Now you can pick another number. You might say, well, gosh, everybody's selling houses online now, and that's what gives us a lot of relief. So because at first, 5-6 years ago, the first reaction was, gosh, you mean I got to take my house for sale sign down in 30 days or 45 days or something like you would see in the election signs? Well, that's not uncommon now because of the internet and everything else. But that makes it tough for boards like you. What is it? What is the magic number in residential areas? Is it 90 days? There is one.
Rick, may I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
So I've had a sign up in my front yard for 5 to 7 years that says, house for sale, residential property or zone commercial. And we enact this 160D. And all of a sudden we have a new, better sign ordinance. If I own that house, do I take my sign down and put it back up a week later and the whole clock starts over again?
Well, let's look at the frequency and things like that. Frequency and duration. So yes,
Ultimately, my question is,
Yes.
that is addressed.
yes,
Okay.
yes. So if we've got, let me get to that part of the temporary stuff. Well, I just flipped right past it, I guess. Where is my thing on? Because I've got this fancy language that I wrote about. Now these are the ones that don't require a permit. That's why. Let me get back to that part. Okay. So this is. I ended up sticking all this stuff under exempt signs. So we're not chasing around worrying about permits and all that. Which means that until somebody complains, chances are, we're not even gonna really have a way of tracking it. So if somebody leaves that, Mr. Chairman for Mayor sign up too long, and somebody starts complaining, then they'll try to figure out how long it's been up and determine if it's been up too long. If they try to find, if that other sign, for whatever reason, is up too long. So it's captured on page 5. Item P, as in Paul, I have a son named Paul, P as in Paul. 1 temporary sign per property. street frontage containing no more than 4 square feet in copy area in SRF, excuse me, that's actually backwards, I got that, it's a typo I just found, SFR, and the MFT is going to be RMST here. No more than 16 square feet in copy area in these other districts, and no more than 32 square feet in these other districts. Temporary signs are limited to a duration of not more than 6 consecutive months in any one calendar year. And then you have to refer to 17.8 for temporary signs that require a permit, like a sandwich board sign or banners and things like that.
Okay.
So that one little paragraph P right there ixnayed almost, let's say, 7 or 8 pages of material. Because at first I sat down, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this, because I had all this stuff in there. I had all these rules on yard sales, all these rules on political, all these rules on all these different kinds, of signs. And then, believe me, the list goes on. And construction, all this stuff, all this stuff. Now, I do have construction to where it can stay up during the duration of the construction. Fence wraps, which is in T at the bottom of that page, are actually protected by the statutes in 160D independently. So you can put up a fence wrap to advertise your new skyscraper project and keep it up, and it's completely exempt from signage requirements. The state took that ability away from local governments. Okay? But I want you to see that. Kind of see what it looks like. Where's my sticky note? Now that I found my typo, I don't want to lose track of my typo. So that means at a future meeting, you're going to have a new page 5 and 6.
Look, I've got a question, and this is not necessarily a sign question, but I'm not really sure where it comes in. You're beginning to see, at least, in what I travel to, more and more memorials placed on the roadside. How, is that covered anywhere?
No. Somebody would have to, there would have to be some way to tie that into signage. And right now, under the exempt stuff, it's a very good question though, Mr. Chairman. Under the exempt stuff, I don't really have anything like that in there. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole though, because most of the time they're on crosses.
Yes, that's
And
true.
when you run into the religious, RILUP, the Religious Institutions Land Use Protections Act, something like that. It's a federal thing that prevents us from dancing with it if it's got a religious connection. Okay.
I guess where I'm coming from on this, and I realize the sensitivity of the question, but from the standpoint, I'm imagining, say, 2 neighbors, and something has happened at maybe in front of one's house, and the
Yeah.
memorial goes up, the other neighbor begins to complain, and I'm wondering, is there anything in 160D that addresses this topic? Because I know it's a sensitive topic, but it's getting to be a greater.
There's nothing that requires us to do anything about it, and there's nothing that, the only thing that would prevent you from doing anything about it would be religious freedoms and things of that nature. I'd be very careful with that.
Yeah.
So I've not had that question come up before, though, from the standpoint of putting it in there with other types of signage. But that's an interesting point.
Well, I had heard something, and Tim, you mentioned this a while ago, and you stirred old memories for me a little bit when you talk about the verbiage on signs. And I understand now that's sort of an irrelevant thing. So I won't use the real example, but I'll use a fictitious example. So if Sam was to put a sign in front of his house that says, Sam Dedman, 4, city council
Yeah.
versus Sam Deadman, city council. That the exclusion of one word takes it from one category to another, but what you're saying
There's
doesn't
no
really matter what's on
categories
that
anymore.
side. Yeah.
Except, and this is where I'm taking you, I'm driving you around the block here to get you back to this exception.
Okay.
And we're gonna call the great state of North Carolina out now. So, let's see here. On page 2, under prohibited signs, here's my disclaimer. I'm not working for the state, I'm working for this town, and this town's a political subdivision of the state. So they're kind of like our parents, right? So what we have here is a situation, has anybody got perfect parents? I don't. So we have a situation where we have an imperfection in the parenting arena. That's at the local government level when we look at the state government. Because we're a political subdivision of the state, so we have to stay in bounds with them. Item G, under the prohibited signs, and that prohibited sign, I describe them in general, that's usually signs that create problems. That's why they're in the prohibited list, you know? And if any of those are good with y'all, we can change them to the exempt list, or you can put them in a permit list. They can move around. But I want you to look at G. Sometimes the state says we have to let them happen. That's what those references are. Signs erected or displayed on or over public rights of way, other than those erected by governmental agencies for which appropriate encroachment agreements have been executed pursuant to this ordinance, are prohibited. In other words, don't go stick your sign out on the street right away, right? Doesn't matter if it's house for sale, yard sale, political, doesn't matter. You can't do that. Except for this one, signs specifically protected by the provisions of GS 136-32B are not prohibited, provided the requirements of that section of law are met. Now, let me tell you what they are.
Yeah. That's the important part I want to hear.
Well, I can't call them out in here because I would be violating the content neutrality. The state of North Carolina, specifically around 2013, long session, I think it was long session 2013, said political signs can go in state right-of-ways. They didn't do it to town right-of-ways, but in state right-of-ways. And the first thing that happened after that same year was a municipal election, 2013. I'm in a city hall, call comes in. It's a gentleman who's all upset because somebody's put a sign in front of his mother's house on a state highway for somebody she does not support. And he wanted to know if I can get that taken down, because it's out in the road, it's out on the shoulder of the road. And I said, we can't touch that with a 10-foot pole, and you can't either. I said, you know, maybe you or she can call that candidate and tell them that you really are offended because it's, you know, somebody you don't support or something like that. But the state exempted themselves. Now, the reason I put that in this ordinance language right here is because the state of North Carolina has a statute on the books that, in my opinion, specifically violates the U.S. Federal Supreme Court decision on content neutrality, because that section calls it campaign or political or something like that. So to keep because our parents, I'm keeping us out of trouble. So we're prohibiting signs in there except for those that the state said are okay, and we're just gonna stay out of that. That's all we can do. That's why I bounced around it and went past it earlier and said we're coming back. We're going to come back down this thing on the Supreme Court case, and we're going to come back down this path, and we're going to land on this conflict between state statute and what that case directs to do. Yes, ma'am.
about the political signs being up for like 6 months, that we can have them up, but according to like the flags, you can only have them 10 days before and 10 days after. How's that different from you keeping the signs up for that long?
The flags, you're saying the flags in here talk about 10 days after, yeah, that's because we're classifying it by its type, not using its content. When we're talking about those kinds of flags, what page are you on about the,
Oh, I wasn't, I've just been referencing how we can have the political signs up for like ever, but you can't have the flag up supporting them.
I'm not sure which page you're looking at.
I was on the same page as you, I apologize. I just remember you mentioning that the 10 and 10.
Well, now, when I was talking about 10 days, I was talking about under its conventional ordinances that are in effect today. It's very common to have things like yard sales allow for, the sign to be up for 10 days. Under the new ordinance, we can't do it that way.
I got you.
The duration on the temporary stuff is the duration on the temporary stuff. Now, I do have under exempt signs associated with events of short duration for a nonprofit or charitable organization posted for 14 days or less, provided that not more than 24 square feet of signage is posted per property, per street frontage, and they are removed within 2 days. So that's like if somebody wants to put up a hot dog sale banner in front of the church. I just didn't call it a hot dog sale or a church. It's a nonprofit that wants to have an event of short duration. So we're tiptoeing around things in there on the content neutrality. Doing the best we can without there being written law or a case that clarifies the first case. The first case basically threw the baby out with the bathwater. So anyway, that's what is in place in many municipalities now, and has done good with the sign companies and people like that. We did see a big shot in the arm of new banners and temporary signs popping up after that case about 8-9 years ago. We did see because the sign companies, they were all over that kind of thing, So you'll see a lot of that. You'll see towns that try to regulate real estate signs differently, like these developments that'll have a bunch of signs out for model homes open and stuff like that. They're playing with fire, in my opinion. I don't have you doing that. That's my job, is to keep you in what I believe to be safe territory, while still accomplishing as much as possible. Now, what I would suggest to you is that you give some serious consideration to the 6 months on page 5 under item P as in Paul. If 6 months might be too long for you as a community. I'm speaking to you as a community as a whole for Landis. But that's what the language needs to do. It needs to tie it to districts and sizes based on districts with durations that are fair, regardless of whether you're talking about elections or yard sales or selling houses or whatever the case may be. Wish I could be a little bit more direct with those issues, but I'm having to work within the vagueness of what the case guidance gives us. So that's 17. That's the banana on the PB and J. That's just the introduction of it. The next 3 that I'm going to introduce are BLT. 13, 16, and 21 are the bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich. They all go together. 13 and 16 are glued to each other at the hip. 21 is glued to 16 at the hip. What 13 is, it's entitled streets. in new development, now this has nothing to do with the town going out and paving a street. Okay? This has to do with developing new streets, which usually is tied to new subdivisions. Very seldom is it not. Okay, unless the DOT is building a new interstate or something. So what we're talking about is the standards and specifications for new streets that new subdivision developers would be building. Those streets, ultimately, I know a lot of you are somewhat new to the planning board arena, so you may or may not know a lot about this. So I'm going to assume that maybe you don't. Don't let me insult anybody. I don't intend to. But the act of subdivision produces virtually all the new infrastructure that a town has. The new water lines, new sewer lines, new storm drains, a lot of those things that I refer to as street infrastructure or street-based infrastructure. You build a mile of street, you're putting in all this other stuff that goes with it, okay? So we establish criteria, not just for the thickness of the asphalt or the width of the travel lane and things like that, but there's all kinds of stuff that goes with it. It deals with blocks and connectivity and sidewalks and trees and you name it. There's a long list of things, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. But I want to introduce the general subject of 16 as well before we dive into either one of them. 16 is specifically about subdivisions, and it has two. If you look at the table of contents right at the front of tab 16, you'll see that there's regulations about it and there's standards about it. The regulations have to do mostly with the platting and division of land. Okay, the platting and division of land. When you take a 100-acre farm that's one big happy piece of property and you create a network of public right-of-way streets through it, you're actually then breaking it up into smaller chunks. Each block is now another piece of property. The next level is that we divide each of those blocks up into individual lots. Okay? The act of subdivision, it doesn't just magically happen after the street is put in. It actually is tied to more of the paper pushing than anything else. It's when the final plat is recorded and stuff like that, that large piece of property now suddenly becomes a small piece of property. And that may actually happen before the streets are finished. Okay? And you're going to learn a little bit about all of that, how that works. In the old days, you went in and you built all the lines in the streets, and then you started selling off the lots. That sounds logical, but the builders were like, well, wait a minute, why can't we be in there working on the houses while they're working on the street at the same time? So performance guarantees were invented. Okay, it's kind of like bonding, if you will. So if a developer wants to get started on the vertical construction, that's the houses, while they're still working on the site-related work, that's the streets and grading and pipes and all that, what they typically are required to do is the developer is typically not the home builder. Not until very recently was the developer the home builder. They would develop and then they would sell a group of lots to this builder and to that builder and to these other builders. Those builders, before they could get their construction money to start putting the house up, had to be able to secure that financing with their bank, and to do that they needed to collateralize the lot upon which they were going to put the money in terms of building a house. That's where they're putting the money, by building a house on it. So before they could encumber that lot, that had to be a separate lot. Well, if the street's not finished, then the town's thinking is, well, wait a minute, we don't want you out there with lots that don't have adequate public access and infrastructure and utilities and everything else before somebody looks up one day and they own one of these lots and they don't have the services they were promised. So we're going to put in place a system for performance guarantees. Well, that's all in here. Those performance guarantees enable that final plat to be recorded, which is the final plat being recorded can happen before the first tree is cut down. But that's the actual act of subdivision. That's when that 100 acres suddenly became a whole bunch of little lots with a big piece of public right-of-way and maybe some open space and a park and all these other things on paper. That's when they suddenly become their own independent little individual pieces of land, of property, okay? So all that's what's in this stuff up front is getting that set up. That's what's in that first 9 pages roughly, or 8 pages.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Particular subdivision that I know of. What is it when the roads are bonded, is it, and they need to be able to turn them over? Is it to the town, or how does that work?
Okay, well, that's kind of what I'm describing. They've put all those bonds in place, or the financial guarantee, or performance guarantee it's called. That can be a letter of credit, it can be cash, it can be a bond, it can be any number of things. And we can't restrict which form it is anymore. We used to be able to, but the state has taken that authority away from local governments now over the past, since the 2015 long session. Then, but what that means is then you would, let's say you go in and you get the base of the road and you get a lot of the work done, then you might get a partial release of some of that money. Because if you did a letter of credit, for example, the bank is actually holding it against your line as if you've already borrowed the money. So you want to get, the developer's going to want to get those releases as quick as they can get that infrastructure in. But then they get down to the last little bit of pavement that might be done after all the houses are built so it doesn't get torn up by the contractors. They'll have the base, then they'll have the primary course of asphalt, then they'll have a surface course of asphalt. And they play a different role. That's why you see manholes sticking up 1.5 inches.
Well, it's the developer
Valve
I'm
boxes
thinking of.
sticking up. That means there's another 1.5 inches coming in to cap it. Well, the base that's there now, that base layer is not very protective. It's a strong layer. It's got a lot of aggregate, which is rocks, stone in it, that's really strong, but it doesn't do a good job of sealing. It allows a lot of water to penetrate through, which can deteriorate the compacted base material. So you want to get that surface course, which is that really smooth one. It's got a lot more bitumen, which is your oil-based product, okay, that will sheet the water off of it rather than letting it settle in. So it actually kind of seals as well. It's also easier to skateboard on or something, okay? So with that said, while that sequence is taking its course and the houses are being built and everything else, the developer's wanting to get those releases. And so when they get their final work done, they get that final course, surface course on, then they have a warranty period. Mm-hmm. And then they are required by general statute, that's what I'm pointing at right there, to petition the town governing board for acceptance. Okay? Now, when they recorded the final plat, before they even broke ground, that's when they offered and dedicated those street right-of-ways to the public. So the public actually had the right of way, walk on that property, okay? On that, where the street's gonna be. But there was nobody that had accepted maintenance responsibility for it yet, so it was still the developer, right? So the act of acceptance by the town governing board accepts it into the maintenance system, which is called the Powell bill system, Powell bill, okay, system. And what that does, and you want to get that, that's really the conclusion of the subdivision process, when the governing board accepts it for Powell, inclusion in the Powell bill system. That's when it's all done, the developer, other than any warranty for that year or whatever that might overlap with that acceptance, that's when it is no longer a privately maintained street. So some people will say, well, does the developer still own it or does the town own it? The public owns it, and owned it ever since day one that final plat was recorded. That has nothing to do with maintenance. The developer's still responsible for maintaining it until the town accepts maintenance. So there's two categories, there's two levels. One is public versus private ownership of the street. The other is public versus whatever maintenance of the street. Now, I hope I've kind of made that clear. So part of the subdivision process makes all those streets public, okay? Unless it's like a gated community or whatever. And I still say you build them to the same standard. So you've got a public right-of-way, and then at the end of it all, the town board accepts it for public maintenance. And you want to do that as soon as you can, as soon as it passes all of its inspections and everything, because you enter that in the first 15 days of July every year into your Powell bill submittal. Do you remember doing that this year?
I was not here in July.
In July. Well, guess what? You will be this time.
Yeah.
That is a tricky thing. You got to get it in there. You don't want to let that linger. If you do, you leave money on the table. And that's tax money that everybody paid anyway. But if you don't get that street into your accepted maintenance system, then the money that would naturally go for that mileage or whatever stays with the DOT in Raleigh. The taxes were paid, but they didn't come home. They sat up there. So you want to get those as soon as they're finished, as soon as you know everything's good, warranty's good, everything, get them in, because they're probably, those streets are probably good for about 20 years if they're built properly. They're good for about 20 years before you have any real issues other than getting a tennis shoe out of the storm drain or something. So you want to start collecting that, bringing that money home. It's not a new tax. When somebody bought gas right there, they paid it. The money just didn't come back. It went to Raleigh and stayed in Raleigh instead of coming back to town. So you want to get it into that system. So that is the acceptance for public maintenance. Okay?
So if the developer didn't finish the top layer and the manholes are still sticking out,
Then the developer's still maintaining the street. The town would not have accepted it yet unless the town made a mistake. Chances are, see, it's a public street.
Right.
Because of the final plat dedicated it to the public.
Right.
When that developer signed that final plat saying, I give it free and clear. In fact, if you'll look at the page, the last page of tab number 7, we'll show you exactly what that looks like. It was next to the last page. If you go to the end of tab 7, there's the last 3 pages are certifications. There's 3 pages of certifications at the end of 7. The first one is for all subdivisions. That means little ones, big ones, and everything. The second page of certifications is additional certifications for major subdivisions. That's basically where new street infrastructure is being dedicated. And halfway down that page is a bold line, and right below it says Certificate of Streets and Other Public Infrastructure Improvements. Right above it is Certificates of Approval for Street and Road Maintenance. I hereby certify that we will maintain the streets and roads to the standards set forth by the town of Landis and North Carolina Department of Transportation until respective governmental agency accepts the responsibility by adoption of a resolution stating such, this, so-and-so. That's how that happens. This is how they have to put these on their plat. That first one at the top is the one I want you to see on that middle page. It says additional certifications. We certify that I am the owner of the property, and we hereby dedicate all roads, alleys, walks, parks, and other sites to the public use except as noted this to so-and-so, as noted on that plat. This to so-and-so. That's where that owner gives all of those street right-of-ways and parks and anything else to the town. Now the town, or to the public, they give it, they turn it over to the public, okay, to the public. That's you, me, that's all of us. That's network, and then they could turn them in to the state through their Powell bill annual report, and the money would go up. The check coming to the town twice a year would go up. That's the gasoline tax you pay to the state of North Carolina, gets divided between DOT and towns, based on your mileage and based on your population. It's a little formula, okay? So you want to be able to collect that money, so you got 20 years worth of money sitting there before the first time you have to do anything, okay? That's how that works. So if you still see those manhole frame and cover sticking up and all that, that means the developer is still maintaining it and probably signed that certification number 2 or something that looks like it. If they didn't, if the plats here in your old ordinance didn't require that,
we're going on year 3.
that's a long time for base course to be exposed.
Mm-hmm.
That means that not the base course, the intermediate course to be exposed. The base which is dirt. It might have soil cement in it, but generally it's dirt. Can actually end up absorbing too much water when that intermediate course is exposed to the elements before that seal of the surface course goes on. you'll see that in the, what will become tab number 24. Ultimately, you don't have it yet, but you'll be getting that, which is your standards and specifications manual, which actually has street cross sections, things of that nature that deal with pavement thickness, types, all that. So that's how that fits together. So 16 is about the subdivision process. The second half of 16 is about subdivision standards, which starts to relate back to streets in talking about things like blocks, okay? And there's a relationship in there. Part of it's about the design of the neighborhood, the layout of the streets. Part of it's what the streets how the streets are actually built. So there's lots of little tiers. So 16 and 13 are the bacon and the lettuce, okay? But a BLT isn't a BLT till you get that slice of tomato. That is the open space that goes with it. So in the open space, Article 21, that's your little parks and everything else that are built in. And we're going to be going through in our film strip exercise in March, you'll get to see how all these things fit together, because when you read this, you're going to learn about squares and plazas and parks and forecourts and greenways and natural open spaces, and how all those things fit into creating neighborhood. Okay? A lot of towns make the mistake of saying, well, we want 30% open space. But there's no criteria. So what do they get? They get the floodplain and a couple of other things and no improvements, and all the houses back up to it, so you can't really even go down there unless you live backed up to it. This goes into making sure it's accessible and it's built into the community. You know, if you're gonna have a subdivision with a bunch of houses in it, you need places. And so we're gonna be talking about, it doesn't show up in your ordinance this way, but we're gonna be talking about in the slide, in the film strip day, we're gonna be talking about what I refer to as the matrix, the open space matrix, which is public versus private open space, improved versus unimproved open space. And I'll give you a hint about that. Private open space is what you might affectionately refer to as your backyard. Public open space would be the park. Unimproved public open space might be a natural greenway along a creek where there's not a bunch of improvements. An improved public open space might be a ball field or a park with tables and other things, your swimming pool. Okay. Private unimproved might be a farm. Okay. So we factor these things into the equations as we create places, interesting neighborhoods, quality neighborhoods. And that's how 13, 16, and 21 come together, because one of the first slides you're gonna see is about terminating vistas, and you'll see that in the streets. Terminating a vista. That's when you come in the entrance of a subdivision, what is it? What's the experience? Well, do you just see houses? Or do you see something that creates kind of a focal point and kind of has a little bit more of a sense of place to it? You're going to see that in images so that you can start going, I get 13, 16, and 21 now. Okay? So that concludes the introduction of articles for this meeting, and the next meeting will be March the 9th, I believe it is.
Yes, that's right.
So 13, 16, and 21 have been introduced. They will be back on your agenda for review and discussion, any questions you have and all that at the next meeting. So with that said, Mr. Chair, I have nothing further, and
Okay.
turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, before we wrap this up,
Do any members of the board,
y'all have any questions or anything that we need to go over before we adjourn?
I do ask Rick, do you think that once a month meeting until such time as we turn this thing over to the town board is gonna get us where we need to be?
You're gonna be real close real quick, with me rolling it out. My suggestion to you is that you do 2 in March as well. Because just looking at where we go, there are really 5 articles left to be introduced. 3 are real character articles. They're the districts, they're the uses with additional standards and special use permit type things, and then they're also the building and lot types. But you've also got a couple of mandates that I'm still wrestling with the town engineer on, and we finished up some stuff today with the flood people and all that. Those mandates are places where we don't have a lot of leeway, but we gotta make all the other agencies and people happy, the town engineer, stuff like that. So that's what makes up at least one of the other articles, that deals with watershed, stormwater and watershed, okay? So you've got 4 more. So at your next meeting, and then we get to the map, which is what glues everything to the ground. So at your next meeting in March, if I can introduce articles either 10, 9, and 8, or at least 10 and 9. And then at the second meeting in March, Article 8 and the table and the map. Or maybe I can get all 3 of these out at the beginning of March and the map and the table at the end of March. Then you will have the whole basket. I mean, I'll be sharing that technical standards manual with you and things like that, but that's mostly engineer stuff. The statement of consistency and reasonableness is 1 page, basically. It's just something that has to go with this as it goes through the adoption process. It says this reflects your town plan, which Tom hadn't even got to your town plan yet, so we're still a little bit off from that. What I'm trying to do is get everything in your hands in March that I can, so that in April, if you met once or twice, you could get it out of your hands. Because the bottleneck I face is that then I've got the Board of Aldermen, and all I've got is May and June. That's it.
I don't know how the rest of the planning board members feel, but personally, I'd rather go ahead and meet twice a month and get it behind us, rather than come down to a crunch time and have a 5-hour-long meeting.
Thank you.
I agree.
And as long as we have a quorum, I would suggest that's how we move forward.
Well,
I agree with that.
I guess we're at the point now, we need to hear a motion.
Well,
Before we vote, I do have one thing I'd like to share. In talking to, we have a couple of members that are not here tonight, and one of them had brought up a question regarding the day of the week. Wednesday being a not so favorable day because of church service on Wednesday nights.
Right.
And I don't disagree with that.
Well, your normal meeting night is
Tuesdays.
Tuesday, but because I had a conflict on that late Tuesday, which you're not gonna believe this, but it ended up being canceled. That would have been yesterday.
Sure.
Let's look at, if we look at March now, if your regular scheduled meeting date is the 9th, and you were to continue 2 weeks later, it'd be Tuesday the 23rd.
That's correct.
And we could go ahead and kind of anticipate that those meetings are gonna be continued, because you still only have 1 meeting a month. You're just recessing and then reconvening the same meeting 2 weeks later.
Right.
So if you want to, and with your permission, I'll go ahead and lock that in. If I put it in my calendar, then I'll tell you who it was, Sanford. They had me hold it, and then didn't even cut me loose till yesterday.
Well, I'd like to do this before we do a motion and a vote on this thing. I want to hear some discussion from the board, just to see, from a calendar standpoint, how does March 23rd look?
That day works for me.
It may work for you, Kim?
It may, I don't have a calendar with me,
Oh, okay.
which is, I mean, that's fine.
Works for me.
Well, if you do that, and then when we get to April, that means in April, your meeting is on Tuesday, the 13th. And,
Right.
it's quite possible that you can, at the meeting in April, that you can send it up. If not, then the 27th would be sticking with the same criteria of the fourth Tuesday, and I'm gonna pencil it in, and the goal should be that it gets sent up at the latest by then. I can keep up with y'all, I can make any changes, I can get that stuff done so fast. You know, it's your pace. I always worry about the board,
Yeah.
you know, because the town started the process really late, you know, really late. And that puts pressure on you. And I
Sure.
want to make sure, you don't have to memorize it all because the book will be there. But once it's adopted, that's it. And then the way to change it would go through an amendment process and all. So it's not insurmountable by any means. But if there's something that, and there may be something that you just don't zero in on. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you can get it out the door by the end of April at the latest, early April would be better. Because see, with them, I'm going to have to do probably get them to dedicate a. Now I have some towns that look heavily at their at their planning board, and they trust them. And I have some towns that want to go through and nitpick everything to death. You know, look behind them, look behind everything, and what have you. So I just don't know what they're going to be like.
So your calendar right now shows April the 13th is our first regularly scheduled.
That's your normal meeting date, and then you'd continue
On the 27th.
to the 27th. If you stick to this thing, and I went ahead and penciled them down so I don't have somebody reach up and go, oh, you know, what if we continue to the 23rd? I go, got a conflict. Because here's what you're up against. Some of you are fairly new to this, but just so that you know, there are 550 municipalities plus 100 counties in North Carolina. That's 650 planning boards. For some reason or another, virtually all of them meet either the first or second Monday or Tuesday. So that's prime real estate in people's calendars when it comes to planning board meetings. And that's, you know, that's why I say this. You're not unusual having a second Tuesday. You're not unusual at all being a second Tuesday. The planning boards that I typically don't have a problem with, a lot of times will be Thursday night meetings.
So you're good with these 4 dates at 5:30 in the afternoon,
I'm great.
which is all Tuesdays.
Now, you're not calling for them to be meetings, you're just calling for those to be the predetermined, because I think what you want to do is still continue your meetings.
Right.
But they're predetermined, anticipated continuation dates. Predetermined, anticipated continuation dates. That's for the minutes.
23rd.
23rd, thank you.
Yeah.
Is that what you're looking for, Ronnie, a motion to do exactly what we're discussing?
Yeah, I think if we're gonna make a decision tonight, we're gonna have to have a motion to vote on this thing. What I would like to hear us discuss, though, is to take this one step at a time, so we could discuss and make a decision on, say, the first date you offered up, which was the 23rd.
That's March.
And the reason I'm saying that as a discussion point, I'm trying to see if we can have others here to vote on the next date,
Okay.
rather than try to project out too many days ahead of time with not everyone here tonight. So, but certainly we need to be making a decision for that double up in March. So I'm listening to see if there's a motion for that.
What happens if we don't nail this thing down tonight, Rick, with you for these 2 dates of the 23rd and the 27th? Is there a possibility we'll lose you?
Yeah. I mean, I've got them, I wrote them in my calendar,
Yeah.
but I put a question mark behind them until I know.
Yeah.
Because I do have to juggle sometimes. I do have to have another staff person cover like a hearing.
Right.
Like, for example, I've got, the night I'm sitting here in April, the beginning, the April 13th, I think it was, I'll actually have one of the plans that I've done being handled by one of my staff members in Lowell, because they happen to have a public hearing that night at the governing board level.
Right.
So it happens, it does happen. I've got you written down now, and I'll hold that. That's why I just refer to it as an anticipated continuation schedule. So you're not locked into it.
I guess the only other thing is to send an email to the whole board and ask and see if these dates do work, to
Yeah.
get feedback that way.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be the factor here. We don't wanna lose you on the schedule. That's, and I know that's what you were looking at, but I also don't wanna promise something that we can't meet, because we have to have a quorum here to make sure this thing happens. And that's the other side of this coin.
Well, the good thing about, this is what I would share with your other members, is that the good thing about looking ahead at these dates is kind of having a handle
Yeah.
on what this extra workload's gonna look like. If we miss one of those, then it's gonna push that extra workload, and it's gonna start compounding it. So it's really smart to have a couple of identified continuation
Sure.
candidates
Yeah.
there, and then let them know, and if they give you some pushback on it, then all you gotta do is in the motion. That's why I didn't want you to call them as meetings. If you call them as meetings, now they're meetings. You gotta have them. If they're continuation dates, we're just reserving them in the calendar, but until that meeting comes on March the 9th, until the end of the March 9th meeting, you're not gonna make it official that it's March 23rd.
Won't vote on it until.
Right.
And that's for that segment. Tonight wraps this one and the 9th up.
So I think, that's right. So I think what the motion that's on the floor is really just identifying candidate dates for the purpose of putting placeholders in the calendar. So I kind of like the idea, but I also understand your concern, but you're not married to them. That's why if you just identify them as candidates for the continuation, so people can look ahead, and if you have a lot of conflicts with the other members, it's not gonna be a problem.
Okay,
At the
so we don't
March
have
meeting,
to
you can
actually
move.
vote on this thing tonight from that perspective then.
I think tying it down as a candidate
Yeah, right,
So,
through a vote would be smart, but you're not locked to it.
okay.
so the motion that, I would put forward, hopefully I'm doing this correctly.
You're fine.
Is to have the 3/23 as a continuation date based off of the candidate's availability,
Absolutely.
a motion.
All right, so I've got a motion on the floor.
The candidate's availability or the board member's availability?
Board
Board
member,
members.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Mark.
Okay,
And the 27th of April.
Yes, and the 27th of April.
Also.
Yep, so it'd be the continuation dates of 3/23 and 4/27 based off of the board's availability.
And I'm hoping we don't have to go to that, well, then that's the second one in April.
Right.
okay.
I
I'd like
second
to
it.
second that.
So we've got a motion and a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, so carried, good. All right.
So if there's a way to let the whole planning board know, all the members of the planning
Yeah.
board know, that we're hoping to hold those out in case they're needed. We
Yeah.
know that the one in March will be needed. If it doesn't work, then we can adjust it. The problem would be it kicks you over to a Wednesday or a Thursday. Right now, that Thursday looks fine, the 29th.
Yeah.
What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a pencil mark there, though.
29th or 27th?
On the 29th, just in case the 27th doesn't,
Gotcha,
excuse me,
as a
not,
backup.
I'm sorry, let me back up to March, that's the one I mean.
Yeah,
That's the one I mean. I hope we don't need the one in April. The one in March
and that's the 23rd as the
Yes.
original date.
is the 23rd. I'm gonna pencil,
You-
Thursday, the 25th,
Gotcha.
Oh, it's backup, okay.
just in case.
That's an alternate date,
In case the 23rd doesn't work.
right?
Just so if I get, because if this calendar gets picked up and used all the time, and somebody looks and goes, he's free.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'll be in another one of these tomorrow night. I had one Monday night, I thought I had one last night, and then I've got this one, and then I've got one tomorrow night.
Wow.
Yeah, so, thank y'all for being sensitive to me surviving this.
No, thank you. Your
I've never
time.
had a wave like this, ever. It's because of the statutes changing.
Okay,
All
so,
right.
so we have what I call tentative dates, is that correct? Make sure I'm using the words correctly, March 23rd, and then April 27th.
Those are for continuations, right? Is that the correct term?
Yeah,
Well, it'll be a,
continuous.
yeah, it'll be a, we'll recess the first meeting, and then we'll
Continue.
adjourn, or re-adjourn on the other one, so
Reconvene.
reconvene, excuse me, yeah. So that's gonna be one of these things where we'll, and Amber, I'm asking you on this one. So from the minute standpoint, we'll see the minutes after we adjourn that second meeting of the month. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is still part of the the February 9th minutes.
That's right.
It's gonna show a recess and then
That's right.
reconvening on a different date.
Okay. Okay.
We put a motion to adjourn.
We're about 30 seconds away. Any other discussion while we're here? Okay. Do I have a motion that we adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second that one.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bill
you.
passed. Thank you very much, Rick.
Oh,